now is time and ripe, especially at 250 years of this nation, is to think about what is the more expansive vision of citizenship, more expansive vision of our nation, so that for me, when we think about America becoming majority people of color in the next 2 decades, one of the other trends, if we had done nothing when this report came out, was that Black and brown people were also projected to have 0 to negative net wealth in the next 2 decades. So if you have a demographic majority of people, but also people who have no economic power and are really strapped in terms of their economic abilities, around just being safe and well and secure economically, what does that mean for America?
Hi, everyone. This is Juan Carlos Ordóñez with the Oregon Center for Public Policy. As we approach the 250th anniversary of our nation's founding, it's fair to say that we're living at a critical moment in our nation's history. Authoritarianism is on the march. Our democratic institutions are under threat, and not only from the actions of the Trump administration, but also due to the vast concentration of economic and political power in the hands of big corporations and billionaires. In this moment, we need a reimagining of our nation, according to today's guest, Taifa Butler. Taifa is president of Demos, a public policy organization working to build a just, inclusive, multiracial democracy and economy. And earlier today, I spoke with Taifa about where our nation stands right now and what needs to happen to ensure that everyone in our country can enjoy real freedom and dignity. Before I get to my conversation with Taifa, though, I just want to take a moment to say thanks for watching the show, and please do us a big favor by subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It helps a lot. So thanks, and with that, here is my conversation with Taifa Butler. Hi, Taifa. Welcome to Policy Full of People. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Juan Carlos. It's so a pleasure to see you after all these many, many years and to join you today on your program.
Likewise. Taifa, why don't we start with you just sharing a little bit about what Demos is, what the mission of the organization is, your core work?
Sure. So I will say that as president of Demos, we are a national think tank or research policy organization. And we've been around for 25 years now, a little over 25 years, focused on a mission to build a just, inclusive, multiracial democracy and economy. We've always worked at the intersection of economic justice, democracy, and racial justice as we think about what is the work that we need to do to really live into a democracy that ensures that everyone has voice and agency and control over our political system, right? And also, as we think about the ways in which we want to build a multiracial democracy, we can't get there unless we have real economic equality, and unchecked economic inequality is just a problem that we have to target and to address. So we've been working over these last 25 years to advance policy solutions and ideas, but our team also works really closely with grassroots organizations. And I would say that Demos as a national think tank prides ourselves on the fact that we can't do this work around advancing ideas without being really tethered and connected to the grassroots and to where the ideas really can germinate to solve some of the problems faced by communities. So we do our work primarily in the research and advocacy and policy domain, but really are about power building at the end of the day.
So we're recording this as we approach the 250th anniversary of the founding of the nation. And as the leader of an organization that works at the intersection of democracy, economic justice, and racial justice, what's your assessment of where the nation stands today? How would you describe the state of affairs here?
Yeah, we are at a critical juncture in our nation. And I would say that it's a defining moment for where we are to go and whether or not we'll live into this vision of truly having a multiracial democracy. And, when I think about the history of this country and how our economy was built on extraction and racialized capitalism, and at this moment right now where we're seemingly have made so many strides in the last 60 years around civil rights, and advancing a more inclusive democracy with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. And we've seen over the last 60 years those civil rights protections being eroded, not only through the courts, but through some of our legislative making, or policy making, I should say. And so there's, I think, a big challenge in our nation of who belongs. And I think you see that play out through the immigrant justice work, through this immigration battle, and how people are being snatched off the street and disappeared, and being detained in these centers around the country, is that America has to decide, especially at the 250th anniversary, if we are going to be a nation that really lives into this Constitution of liberty and justice for all. We've got some real work to do to change what we think and what we believe. And that's the norms work that I believe is important. And we'll talk about that later in terms of some of the work that we're thinking about, building a third Reconstruction. So I just think we've seen this pendulum shift over the last 60 years of undermining civil rights and civil protections for Black and brown people in this country. And I think the thing that keeps me up at night is the fact that America is projected to be majority people of color in the next 2 decades. And if we are not changing our systems and really ensuring that Black and brown folks in particular have voice and agency and economic and political power in our democracy and in our economy, we will never get to the vision. And so I just think this is a real moment of crisis, and it's a real moment of opportunity at the same time. And I think what we're seeing across the nation with the economic populism and the people, feet in the streets, and people are demanding and protesting because of what they're seeing right now. That's the kind of energy that we'll really need to bring about, I think, this next remaking of America.
You've written that to understand how we got to this situation, you need to look into the cyclical relationship between economic and political power. Can you explain that relationship between economic and political power?
You think about, if you have economic power in this country, you are more likely to have more political power. And if you have more political power, you're likely to have more economic power. And that's just a really vicious cycle that we see that we need to break in this country, because we found that those who have higher means, more wealth, are able to influence the political rules that then govern how much money they can make, and vice versa. Those that have money can tweak the political rules so, again, that they have more economic power, and it benefits them in terms of their wealth generation or the regulation of businesses. They are able to carve out those kinds of things that keep them untethered by some of the rules and the laws and the policies that should govern, extreme wealth and should govern corporate behavior. And so I believe that our work today is to break that vicious cycle of the powerful, the wealthy elite being able to write rules that benefit them, and really reimagine a cycle that's more virtuous, that we are making it such that people have the kind of political say and influence and control over our democracy, where they can help write rules that help build the public good, that help, ensure that people can have the kind of quality of life that they need, good jobs, they be able to have the safety net, but also opportunities to have worker rights and worker protections and worker power that ensures that our economy is working for everyday people.
So, Taifa, we at the Oregon Center for Public Policy talk a lot about the importance of increasing worker power. And we talk about it as something that is absolutely necessary if we want an economy that works for all of us. But you also talk about worker power as being critical to having a well-functioning democracy. I wonder if you can discuss that connection between worker power and democracy.
That's a great question. Policy after policy, cycle after cycle, we know working people are shown that their labor is a commodity, right? And not a contribution. And workers today, particularly low income workers, are being pushed out of economic and political life. Whether or not they're being disempowered on the job or at the bank, or even at the ballot. And so I think, as we look at some of the economic indicators where wages are suppressed, families, workers have fewer resources, and then also less capacity to engage politically, and invest in their own sort of civic life and civic power. Like, it is really, I think, time that we center workers as a core voice and constituency when we think about our democracy.
How do race and racism factor into this dynamic, into this relationship between economic and political power?
Well, if we think about the history of this country, and the fact that we have a long history from the 400 years of enslavement, and the institution of slavery in our country that was about extracting labor for free from Black bodies in this country. And all of the rule making and the policies that have resulted from that baseline of slavery, and how white institutions and white families were able to generate wealth. And then when we finally got to emancipation and the first Reconstruction and the Reconstruction amendments in the Constitution that enabled people to, again, not to end slavery, but then to have the political power to participate in elections, and then also give people birthright citizenship for those who were born in this country in enslavement. Those were the things that really opened up our Constitution for citizenship for Black people who were property and who were not seen as human beings. So that underlying beginning of our country, still we are experiencing the fallout and the ramifications of not only those norms and values and beliefs, but how they've been coded into the rules and the policies throughout the history of this country, from the GI Bill, the exclusion of Black people being able to have homes in certain neighborhoods due to redlining in the banking industry, from the GI Bill and some of our Black and brown people of color who served in military who weren't able to benefit from some of the policies that white families did. There's just been a host of ways that our government has perpetuated economic and democratic exclusion for these communities. And unless and until we really, I think, tell the truth and expose that long history of exclusion and how it has exacerbated where people live in communities, our ability to access the ballot fully and unfettered, and also the wealth generation that is created. And we talk about one of the core problems that have existed given those rules is the racial wealth divide. I just think that we have some real work to do to not only address changing our hearts and our minds and really thinking about like the new norms that we need as a nation, but also how do we repair some of this exclusionary policies and ensuring that people, especially this rising American majority, as I mentioned earlier, that they can fully participate and have power and agency in our society. So I think those are some of the things that historically play an important factor. And then when you think about from our democracy standpoint, the poll taxes and all the things that happened in the past to keep people from the literary test, to keep people from being able to vote. Some of those same policies are playing out today with the SAVE Act, which is nothing more than another barrier to keep people from accessing the ballot. The copycat bills that are happening at the state level across the country, and even most recently, the Calais decision, which really gutted the Voting Rights Act. Act that really minimizes the political power and the ability of Black people and people of color in states to have the ability to have a political voice and political power, but also the ability to have representation that truly represents their needs in their community. So to me, those are still some of the things that are playing out present day that have underlining racist, white supremacist feeling to them, right? That they're driven and animated by racism and white supremacy. And there's no other way to see that.
You referenced earlier one of Demos's initiatives called Toward a Third Reconstruction, and I want to ask you what that is. But before I get into the Third Reconstruction, can you just give us a quick overview of the other two reconstructions, just to sort of set the context?
The first Reconstruction was after the Civil War and emancipation. We had 12 years of what we call Reconstruction, where we had 3 Reconstruction amendments that gave citizenship, that ended slavery, and that enabled Black men to vote. And we had 12 years of what we will call our first go at multiracial democracy. So in the South, we had Black men elected to Congress and other political positions. And so we were really practicing this multiracial governing. Well, after that 12-year period, the period called redemption came, which is when white folks said, no more, we don't want this. And so they ran Black people out of office. They quickly sort of redeemed the time, and with why they're called redemptionists, to ensure Black people didn't have political power. And that's when we went into the period of Black codes, which were restrictive, authoritarian type of laws that really made Black people unable to fully live in freedom. And also we had the season of Jim Crow. And it was during the time of the civil rights movement in the 40s and 50s and 60s that had the groundswell of a multiracial coalition, particularly led by Black people, to make sure that we could live into civil rights for Black people in this country. And that's where we call that the second Reconstruction. The civil rights enabled the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Equal Opportunity Act, which was all to address the discrimination in our economy and for workers. It also enabled us to have access to the ballot with the Voting Rights Act and civil protections against discrimination and all the things that threatened our livelihood. And so we've been living into this second Reconstruction with those civil rights acts and the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Opportunity Act over the last 60 years. And given we've seen some of the retraction and this sort of slow burn of this redemptionist feel, where we've seen the fascists and the narrative stoking the divisiveness of this moment and making sure that people feel afraid or are using language of fear against this sort of rising majority of Black and brown people who are in this country, who have rights and should have the same privileges. And so to me, this is like I said, we're at a critical junction as a nation to live into a third Reconstruction. 60 years of civil rights were good for us, but now we see that we're losing ground, even though we've made tremendous progress. And I think it now is time and ripe, especially at 250 years of this nation, is to think about what is the more expansive vision of citizenship, more expansive vision of our nation, so that for me, when we think about America becoming majority people of color in the next 2 decades, one of the other trends, if we had done nothing when this report came out, was that Black and brown people were also projected to have 0 to negative net wealth in the next 2 decades. So if you have a demographic majority of people, but also people who have no economic power and are really strapped in terms of their economic abilities, around just being safe and well and secure economically, what does that mean for America? We will likely have apartheid in America. And so this, again, for me, Juan Carlos, is a reason why we have to live into a third Reconstruction. Otherwise, we are really creating a more entrenched authoritarian society, given how much power we see being consolidated with the executive branch and this Supreme Court. So this is time. It's time for us.
When I think about the past periods of Reconstruction in this country, obviously they were tremendous advancements for people of color, for Black people in the country in those periods. But I think it's also important to underscore that white people also gained from these massive reforms. So, I work in the field of tax policy, obviously, and I know that during the first period of Reconstruction in the South, for the first time during that Reconstruction period, it was the first time that public schools opened up for Black kids, but also for a lot of white kids as well, a lot of poor white kids. And so it seems that Reconstruction is of benefit to all of us, the kinds of reforms that bring about the true democracy, true economic justice. I wonder how if you see that as well.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think some of the benefits of the first Reconstruction, as you mentioned, were some of the Black lawmakers who came into leadership during that time were the proponents of public education. And we saw even in the extraction or the racial capitalistic economy where it was all on slave labor, and then you had the plantation owner be, sort of the operator in our economy, that also, America has its roots in, even in Georgia. What was the framing for it? Was sort of this, not only the in debtors colony, so people who were in debt came to the state of Georgia and had to serve out their debts to the government and that sort of thing. So, and those were poor white workers. And so there's a history of sort of this class approach to really try to create division among the working class and white working class and Black working class and the other communities of color who are working class people. And I think the amendments not only gave, citizenship and enable people to participate, even though we also saw convict leasing and some of the other laws that really kept Black people from being able to earn fair wages and being able to have the freedom necessary to support their families. But to your point about white workers, some of the laws that really helped address the discrimination and even the diversity, equity, and inclusion laws were able to benefit some of the workers, particularly white women and others who didn't have access to jobs in the economy. So you're right. I think as we talk about if there are ways that we can reimagine our economy and make sure that it can work for people of color who've been excluded, poor white workers, other workers in the working class can benefit from those more inclusive policies, especially those who are in rural communities who are also struggling to make ends meet. And I think as we try to imagine a more progressive but also expansive public good, public education is a public good. Housing and healthcare is a public good. If we can think about ways to invest in those public goods, all people, regardless of race and ethnicity and geographic location, can benefit from those core components that help create a good quality of life. So those are the things I believe if we can create the vision for a good sort of solid public goods system that includes, housing, care, public education. We know that has been dismantled right now, but reimagining public education and all of these things that would help people not only have a level playing field, but it will ensure a good quality of life for every resident and citizen in this country. Those are the things I believe we need to be thinking about more expansively versus the box that, these rich, wealthy capitalists have written into what's allowable. Their goal is to create the biggest profit margin that they have, and they're willing to pay peanuts to workers. They're willing to create unfair labor conditions and working conditions because, again, it benefits their bottom line. But if we can expand what's truly possible in our economy, where people can be healthy and well and safe and secure economically, this country could still benefit. And I just think we just have to have a complete mind shift.
Speaking of mind shifts, back in 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and the massive racial justice protests that took place, one might have thought that the third Reconstruction had arrived. I don't think we are. I wonder what you think of the aftermath of those protests and what that says about kind of where we are today and the way forward.
Oh, I love that idea. We had in our third Reconstruction series in Nonprofit Quarterly a few months ago in November and December that we published a series of essays. And one of the essays, we invited Professor Peniel Joseph out of UT Austin to write this piece to ground us on the third Reconstruction. And what I loved about Dr. Joseph's piece, but also his body of work, he wrote a book on the third Reconstruction. So I thought he was expert in sort of helping to frame that. But he proffered and posited in that book that since George Floyd and the rise of the movement for Black lives and a lot of the racial justice work that we saw over the last 5 years was the making of a third Reconstruction. And I think that point is debatable, but I do think it created a good groundswell and appetite for change. And we saw a lot of that drumbeat is still playing out and is now, I think, also being amplified through the current resistance work and the current pushback from communities around the country, that this authoritarian consolidation of executive power is not in response to the racial justice moment, and it's also taking us backwards. So I think for us is this last 5 years since George Floyd's death, we know that we won't get to live into these constitutional sort of principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and protecting the general welfare. Like, we won't live into that until we tackle the racial injustice in this country. I think that's what's really salient and why Demos keeps that at the center of our work. In our ecosystem, that all of us who are proponents of a multiracial democracy and care about justice and care about an economy that works for everyone, the recognition of our sordid history and the issues of racism and white supremacy in our country keeps us from being great, if I'm honest, right? And I think that's where we have to tackle not only the harms and our norms and beliefs, but the fact that our institutions are built on those norms of exclusion and injustice. Those are the things that we must weed out in order for us to live honestly into this new the new society for America, this new world of a majority of Black and brown people who, again, if we want them to live fully as citizens, and I've been using this sort of term around radical citizenship, why do we have to be relegated to live in boxes and not have unfettered ability to speak into the rules, right? To be able to write the rules and ensure that people are at the center of those rules. Well, I think we have a moment as we think about this third Reconstruction. And I think a lot of us who do policy work, and as you do tax policy work, you think about what are the incremental things that we can change, some of the rules that have some appetite that people are like, oh yeah, that's feasible, we could fix that. I think we need to scrap it all and really think more expansively about the future. Because if we think about our opponents and those who would uphold white minority rule, those who want to hoard power, they have been working for the last 50 to 60 years to undermine the civil rights gains that we've realized for Black and brown people in this country, and to go back to a more exclusionary society. And that is where we all say, no, we're not going back. So I think, Juan Carlos, this moment, we have to. There is no going back. What we've seen over the last nearly 2 years now with this administration, this government has been dismantled. The public good has been eroded. And so there's no hitting the button, new election, we've got new folks, and we could just restart the clock and sort of resume the status quo activities. There's no way that we can go back to what was. We must rebuild going forward. And that's where I think we have to be excited and innovative, and not afraid to reimagine this country.
So if we're talking about reimagining the country and being ambitious, thinking expansively, what would be the top changes that would really make a difference? Be it policy changes or structural changes, what would it look like? What is the third Reconstruction really, what's it really centered on?
That's a great question. In my piece, I offered sort of a framework of 3 things, and they're high level. And I think we all as a community need to think about the nitty gritty and the bones. But part of, what I've been sharing today is the norms. Our country is built on norms that have been exclusive, that have been extractive, that have been about, white supremacy, and the lack of humanity, right? If you think about the beloved community and Martin Luther King, and, how can people live free of deprivation, right? Like, how are we changing the ways in which our society is built in the foundation? And so that work is really about what's the ways that we shift our hearts and our values and our beliefs in this country. And I think that's going to take all of us. And I know, like people who do tax and analysis and budget work, that's more on the concrete policy, technical stuff. But I know that there will be people that have to make the case of vision. I loved how some of our partners and funders have been talking about this irresistible future. Like, if we plant and cast that vision of how much more inclusive and expansive a world could be without deprivation, with human dignity for every person, our institutions then would operate differently. Our policies for engaging with everyday people would be different. So that's one area that we've talked about, is the norms. And I think that's the hardest part, right? How to change people's beliefs and values, but that work has to happen. And then the other part for me is the new forms of power. Right now we are in a contest for power that comes from a hierarchy top down, whether that's the government, the sort of those who are wielding power by sitting in elected office and writing the rules. But then there's this power that's coming up from the ground. That is the civic power, the infrastructure in communities, the grassroots power that's demanding something better and different. That contest is happening every day. And to me, we will have to remake our institutions that really embrace that civic power and that power that's coming from the ground. Because again, I think we use these terms that people who are closest to the problems know the solutions. How do we capture the brilliance that's happening in communities to actually write the rules and bring the solutions that will solve the problems that they face so that their lives can be better? So we'll have to reimagine those forms of power. And I know organizations like yours who are doing, participatory budgeting, how do we think about those governing practices that allow people oversight or insight and transparency so that everyday folks can hold those wielding power accountable. So I think those are some of the very important rules of the game that we'll have to change to build the lasting, durable power for the people and take that away from those who are holding the big purses who get to write the rules right now. And then lastly, the institutions. You know, when I think about some of the training and the conversations we've had about just democracies backslide globally and what that means for America in light of other nations where we see authoritarianism on the rise, one of the I think ironic or oxymoronic things about the US and our exceptionalism is that we have some of the most unjust and anti-democratic institutions when you look globally. So, you know, our Supreme Court, our president's office, the Congress, the fact that our Constitution is the hardest Constitution to amend in the world. We have some real structural barriers to being able to live into the liberatory democracy that we want. So for the folks who want to think about the Senate and abolishing it or changing representation in the House with more people or putting term limits and other ethics controls on the Supreme Court to enable it to be more just. Those are some of the bigger structural things that we'll have to tackle in our country if we are going to really live into one, a third Reconstruction, but two, make sure that people are centered in how we remake it so we don't have this outsized influence by the wealthy and the elite to continue this vicious cycle of power by those who are the richest among us.
What will it take to change the norms and change these structures that you talk about? Like, where does the work begin? I'm wondering if you can provide maybe some words of advice to our listeners who want to engage and want to see a third Reconstruction come about. Like, where should they be engaging right now?
One of the things I believe is important is people feeling like they have a local home, a place in their community where they can just dream and reimagine sort of the world that they want to live in. And I know this sounds a little like, you know, intangible and a little soft, but as I've been reading some work by Ruha Benjamin about radical imagination, and it's like, being able to dream is a privilege, right? And we don't often take time to be in the space and break off the boxes and how closed off our minds are because the rules and the systems have really, and these constructs of race and gender and, economy and working class, like all of those are constructs that we are living into and that we can change. And so I think just getting in a place of feeling like, what would it look like, to have a society where I can frolic. We all have joy. We all have enough. Right? We all can meet not only our basic needs, but we can thrive. And what does thriving look like? And then what are the systems in our community that help us do that? And I know that there are people who, and I've been in debates around this, is, well, we need to stop depending on the government for these things. There's not enough money. That's where the scarcity is. The government isn't supposed to do this. We don't have enough, we don't collect enough revenue to be able to do all of these things to support our communities. That's where the church could come in, or that's where mutual aid can come in. And I think we miss the fundamental point, is that the government's purpose is to provide for the public good and for the general welfare of society. And when government falls short on that, that's where we should hold accountable. And so I think this is where we reimagine what's our city council, what should they be thinking about? It's not just about the potholes in the street or the lights on, but where do we create good public, places for joy? Where do we create places for community? Where do we create the beloved community where, again, we're connected? We are like living into our innate humanity. I think those are the things that, again, we as a society, as those of us who do this work, are really have been just so limited to, here's a policy idea, here's how we rewrite, governance or public banking, or we come up with these ideas to change the systems. But I think, again, what's the big expansive vision? So that's the one thing I would say: get in a place where you can dream with some people, and then if you can find a grassroots organization where you can actually start to put some of those ideas into practice, whether or not it's going to the local town halls, whether it's writing your lawmaker, whether it's showing up for the board meetings of your local city council or your state legislature. Like, what are the ways that you can be in a place to listen and learn about where the priorities are of those who are governing, and then hold them to account? I feel right now our political parties on both sides are captured. When you think about who they're beholden to, the moneyed interests, who's investing in their campaigns, you see so much more disconnect. Are they solving the problems of their communities? Are they advocating for the needs of their constituents? And I would say no, not enough. So I think that's where we need to push to make sure that our voices are heard. And sometimes that looks like feet in the streets, and people talking. It means making phone calls. But again, this opportunity where this government is going in the direction that we don't believe is right, this is where people power is the most important. Not just at the ballot box, but that they hear from us. And so I just hope people feel encouraged enough to speak up.
Well, Taifa Butler, this is, I think, a good place to end it. Thank you so much for being on Policy for the People.
Thank you so much, Juan Carlos, for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and I look forward to staying in touch.